So, colleagues, I see quorum, I see time. Call this meeting to order. Before I call on our witnesses, Mr. Jenkins and Mr. Razoulis, you'll notice that this is, we're going to stretch 1 hour into a little bit more, so we should be able to get 3 rounds of questions in at the very minimum. And you'll notice then that we are not dealing with the health study that we had agreed to. That's in part because we were not able to get the witnesses lined up, and it's all Brian May's fault. Thank you for putting that on the record. Let Hansard read. And then on Friday we will have the health study. Following Tuesday, the minister will appear along with officials for 2 hours. And on the 5th, Parliament is suspended for a day, and then we will resume our health study. We also have some invitations, and I think I'll go through those later after we release our witnesses. But it's a fairly packed agenda till the end of Parliament in June. So with that, I want to welcome an old friend, Mr. Razoulis, to the committee, who's quite familiar with the way in which we operate here, and we'll look forward to him for his 5-minute statement. But before we call him, we'll call on Mr. Jenkins, who is the Senior Advisor to the President, RAND Corporation, for an opening 5-minute statement. Welcome, sir, and appreciate you making yourself available over the course of the next hour or so. So with that, sir, we look forward to what you have to say in the next 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me to comment upon the war in Ukraine. As you may know, I'm responding on short notice, so instead of a polished briefing, let me offer some brief informal remarks. These are based upon a series of essays I wrote for the RAND Corporation. Mr. Wilson, your clerk, has the links. I do want to emphasize that I am not an authority on Ukraine or Russia. My field of research for many years has been political violence, irregular warfare, and psychological operations. I also want to make clear that these are my personal views and not those of the RAND Corporation or, of course, of the U.S. government. My essays attempted to go beyond the battlefield and explore the potential strategic, geopolitical, and economic consequences of the war. Of course, we don't know how the war will turn out. In my essays, I outlined 7 theoretical scenarios ranging from a Russian takeover of Ukraine to a Russian military collapse. I think the more likely scenarios fall in the murky middle and include engrenage, a good French term for which there isn't an English translation that has the same impact, simply a continuing carnage. We could see a stalemate or a frozen conflict, or we could see a range of favorable to unfavorable negotiated settlements. Potentially, we could also see a continuing gradual escalation, which has been the pattern thus far. Whatever the scenario, however, the status quo antebellum will not be restored. The post-Ukraine war landscape will be different. Russia's reputation as a military power has been badly tarnished. Its problems include strategic miscalculations, incoherent execution, and the poor quality of Russian soldiering. Even if it prevails on the battlefield, Russia has been weakened. The war has also exacerbated Russia's demographic crisis. It was fascinating to see the results of a recent poll of global strategists and practitioners conducted by the Atlantic Council, which showed that a surprising 46% of the 167 respondents expected Russia to become a failed state in the next 10 years. On the other side, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has, for the time being, strengthened NATO. However, continued Western support for Ukraine may depend on its continued military success. NATO's southeastern flank is soft. Hungary is pursuing its own course. Romania is very cautious. Bulgaria remains politically divided. Turkey's response has been supportive, but at the same time ambivalent and transactional. Such stresses are not new to NATO. The alliance has survived these kinds of things in the past, but it's always difficult. Looking at the post-war global economy, the war has slowed the economic recovery from the pandemic. The effect in Europe will be more significant. The reconstruction of Ukraine will require a massive investment estimated at 350 billion. The willingness to invest in that reconstruction, especially by the private sector, will depend, of course, on the situation that prevails. I believe that Europe's reliance on Russian energy is over. Russia will find and is finding new markets for its gas and oil, but reduced gas sales to Europe will affect Russia's political influence and state capture, especially in Eastern Europe. We are seeing somewhat of the recreation of a divided Cold War economy in the world, albeit much more complicated than it was 40, 50 years ago. I believe that deep globalization pressures will continue. Global defense spending seems likely to surge. The world is again a more perilous place. Naked military aggression is not ancient history. More than 30 years after the end of the Cold War, we may find these dangers hard to again grasp. But let me stop there, and I'll be happy to respond to your questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Rizoulis, 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to provide an update on the current situation in the Russo-Ukraine war. As of today, the war may be described as being in a strategic stalemate. The last Ukrainian offensive action was last fall when Ukrainian forces pushed back Russian forces in the areas of Kharkiv, in the northern sector of the front, and in Kherson, specifically Kherson City, in the southern sector of the front. Thereafter, the Russians stabilized their defensive lines and Ukrainian forces went over to the defensive. In January, the Russians began a slow, grinding offensive drive across various sectors of the entire front line. The main focus of the Russian offensive has been to capture the city of Bakhmut. The battle for Bakhmut, in the central sector of the front within the Oblast of Donetsk, has been the centerpiece of the Russian offensive drive. While there have been debates within the Ukrainian leadership as to whether, and as well as among U.S. military advisors to Ukraine, as to whether it would have been more effective militarily for the Ukrainian forces to retreat from Bakhmut and establish stronger defensive positions in two towns further west. The final decision taken by the Ukrainian government was to hold on to a tenacious defense of the town. To date, the Russians have managed to push into Bakhmut with pincer movements surrounding the town from three sides, with the Ukrainians holding on to one road to the west, which they use for resupply and evacuation of casualties and refugees. That road remains under Russian artillery fire. The Russians have also managed to push into the center of the town and appear to occupy much of the town, with the Ukrainians doggedly defending the western sections. The battle continues to rage, with latest reports of Russian forces continuing to advance westward in small, incremental steps by seizing building by building and street block by street block. Casualties on both sides have been very high, very much a battle of attrition. Beyond the front lines, the Russians have waged a war of aerial bombardment, largely targeting Ukraine's energy grid throughout the country. The Russians have used a variety of weapons, from cruise missiles to drones of various types. Ukrainian air defense systems have been quite successful in shooting down large proportions of the incoming Russian ordnance. The Ukrainian political military objectives and aims in the war have been clearly stated as the expulsion of all Russian forces from occupied Ukraine, including Crimea. Essentially, the Ukrainian borders of 1991. On the matter of Crimea, commentary appears from time to time about the potential of a diplomatic settlement on Crimea rather than through the force of arms. However, in the main, the Ukrainian position is to use military force to expel the Russian forces from Crimea. The Russian political military objectives may be broken down into maximalist and minimalist. The Russian maximalist objective has been to force a regime change in Ukraine through military action. The intent has been to install a pro-Russian government in Kyiv that would align itself as a close partner of Russia and reject the objectives of moving closer to the West through accession to the European Union and NATO. The minimalist Russian objective is to fully occupy by military force the 4 oblasts in eastern Ukraine that were annexed by the Russian Federation Duma, while continuing to hold on to Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014. The 4 oblasts are Kharkiv, Luhansk, Donetsk, and Kherson. The current front runs through these 4 oblasts and are controlled by Ukraine and Russia to varying degrees. So, where may the war go from here? The expectation is for an imminent Ukrainian spring-summer counteroffensive. In fact, some are arguing that the offensive has actually started. The centerpiece for this offensive is the latest reinforcement of Western arms, such as main battle tanks, infantry armored fighting vehicles, air defense, and artillery systems, with large stocks of ammunition. Most assessments are that this Ukrainian offensive has the potential to punch a hole somewhere in the Russian defensive line and secure an operational level success. It is expected that the Russian defense will be strong enough to prevent a strategic level victory, meaning the expulsion of Russian forces from all of Ukraine, all of occupied Ukraine. It should be expected that the Russians will in turn conduct their own counteroffensive to offset the Ukrainian effort. The resulting effect of the upcoming spring-summer fighting may continue to be a strategic stalemate into the fall. Whether there will be a change in Ukrainian and Russian political positions to move toward a ceasefire and eventual peace talks is impossible to assess at present. It remains very probable that the war will continue throughout 2023 without a ceasefire or political settlement. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Razoulis, Ms. Kramp-Nyman, 6 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to start with Mr. Jenkins. There's no question that the world has changed dramatically over the last 8 years, and you noted in your comments that you expect the global defense spending to splurge. So there's been limited political will to change the sad state of affairs. So I wondered if you could comment on the military deficiencies, be it personnel or procurement, that are becoming a liability for our security partners.
It's a good question. The reason I expect to see and I think we're already seeing it, an increase in defense spending is that, first of all, the Russian invasion, the overt invasion, to a degree has galvanized NATO and has pushed a number of the countries closer to perhaps meeting their pledges to increase defense spending to address some of these deficiencies. That's number one. Number two, it is clear from the nature of the war that the consumption rates of artillery, of drones, and other forms of weapons and ammunition has been intense. And indeed, beyond what was, I think, anticipated by many. I mean, we're going back to World War II levels of consumption. And stocks have been drawn down to meet that. We don't have the production capabilities to maintain that. And therefore, we are seeing some new production facilities come online. Depending on the war in Ukraine, that will use more weapons and ammunition, and stocks will be replenished. I think third, I would point to just the general perception now that the world is again a much more dangerous place, and so that I think that many nations are looking to their perhaps bolstering their defenses, and so overall, I think these will combine to see an increase in weapons acquisitions. And the nature of those acquisitions, in addition to replacement, will be learning from the actual battles themselves as to what types of weapons, drones, air defense systems, and so on are valuable and essential to war in the 21st century.
Do you mind responding if you've seen the Pentagon Discord leaks?
Beg pardon?
Can you comment with regards to the leaks from the Pentagon?
No, I mean, I've been fascinated to read some of it in the press. The investigation as to how this took place is ongoing. I have no detailed knowledge of that investigation. I think there is perhaps a personal view on this. We have a lot of classified material and perhaps a lot of connectivity that may not be necessary. I'm still trying to figure out if how, in fact, the particular individual that has been named in the press came to have access to such a broad array of material. But all of that will have to wait in the investigation. I have no other comment.
Thank you. Mr. Razoulis, there's no question the war is much more complicated than anybody would have anticipated it to be. But over a year ago, you outlined that the war in Ukraine was the most immediate threat facing Canada and the CAF. And you shared that Canada should be front and center in both the defense and deterrence side. Over a year later, how do you feel that Canada has responded to this call to action?
I think Canada has done everything that it is in position to do. Everything is relative. And so the strength of the Canadian forces is a relative balance with Canadian government budgets, so it doesn't get everything it needs or wants. The fact that we have, as we have traditionally done actually, we have put our forces, what I call in the front window. We have actually used everything we have, and I think we've been very good at that throughout our history. And so today we have the lead in Latvia. We have promised to plus up from a battalion group to a brigade group. We're still waiting for the results of that. I'm sure there's a lot of work going on. Whether or not Leopard tanks will join our troops in Latvia is another good question. So I'm looking forward to the Canadian government announcing what it's going to do. But I think everything is relative. But I think the Canadian forces do everything they can. We're in the front window.
Can you possibly comment with regards to you foreshadowing the danger of burnout for our armed forces? Do you feel that Canada has invested in the necessary resources to avoid this burnout? As it appears the war is going to be long-term, has Canada created the capabilities to maintain its stamina?
Yeah. Burnout is an extremely serious matter. As you well know, we're 10,000 personnel short, which means that, so, you know, there's the rule of thumb for deployments. So like Latvia, for example, it's 1/3 deployed, 1/3 training, 1/3 resting. So now we are not in a combat situation in Latvia, unlike Afghanistan, where we were in a combat situation. And there the burnout was extremely serious. Latvia is not the same case. Our troops do not have the stress of combat. They have the stress of training. So it's one step removed from that. But again, given the shortages of personnel, I believe that the Canadian Forces and General Eyre have been very conservative about deploying our forces in addition to what we are already doing, because he's concerned, I'm sure, about maintaining the credible standing of the forces we have in place.
Thank you.
Mr. Fisher, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to both of our witnesses for being here. Mr. Rasoulis, nice to see you again. A lot has happened since the last time you were at our committee, over a year ago. And I'm going to use a quote that you used at the time. The neutrality option for Ukraine is on the table. Now, again, end quote. A lot has happened. A very violent year has passed. From this perspective, it's kind of difficult to have imagined that Ukraine was ever truly neutral as it pertains to NATO and versus Russia. You talked about diplomatically. You talked about Ukrainians using military force to expel Russian forces. I'm interested in your thoughts on what a post-conflict Ukraine would look like diplomatically. I'm also interested in what challenges you think that this poses.
Huge. Let me just. Yeah, I like one. Just for historical accuracy, let me say that Ukraine had a position of non-alignment, not exactly neutrality, but non-alignment from 1991 to 2014. So it was balancing off between the Russians and the West. But as of 14, it really shifted and put joining NATO and the EU firmly into their constitution. So the question is, and this is why there's the war from the Russian point of view. Okay, so the question is, we don't know how the war will end. But, okay, so let's just take the general speculation that there'll be some kind of a stalemate, some kind of a deal. That deal, whatever it is, will no doubt have to have some measure of security guarantees for Ukraine. So one option is they are brought into NATO. But another option is they receive equivalent security guarantees, not just like the Budapest thing, which is a political guarantee, but a hardcore security guarantee that's legal, but not by NATO, but by NATO members individually, certain NATO members. So you have a group of NATO countries that sign up as individual states to provide security guarantees to Ukraine. So it takes away the boogeyman of NATO as a whole, but you have the strength of certain key partners like the United States and so on. So that's another option in there. A complete neutrality and a demilitarized Ukraine, which is the Russian objective, I think is not really a strong card right now for the Russians to play.
Switch gears a bit and maybe give both of our witnesses a chance. I asked this question last week. When you think about China and we think about Russia, we think about the strange relationship that they may or may not have. I'm interested in what your thoughts are, both of you, on what China's interests and objectives are and what Beijing hopes to achieve in the near and the long term by what looks like and appears to be deepening ties with Russia, notwithstanding the fact that they claim they want an end to this. Either or, Mr. Jenkins, you can start.
Mr. Jenkins, sure.
Look, I mean, China is watching this and certainly what happens in Ukraine will have some effect on Chinese decision making. Right now, China is a beneficiary of the developments in Ukraine. It has not completely, but it distracts. It's a drag on the ability of the United States to confront China directly, although the United States is doing so. I don't see that China really wants to start a war over Taiwan. I know the Ukraine war and the Taiwan issue have been connected in the sense that if Russia takes over Ukraine, that this is a green light for China to invade Taiwan. I think that's probably simplistic. China is also benefiting from expanding its influence through soft power in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America. I think the war in Ukraine, having again distracted the Europeans, the Americans, the United States, Canada, everyone else, facilitates that process. I think China is a beneficiary of now perhaps discounted energy supplies from Russia seeking a market. In the relationship between China and Russia, I would say that clearly right now, Russia is the needier junior partner in this relationship.
You still got 45 seconds left, Mr. Razoulis.
So, no disagreements. China is sort of seeing this as it can position itself geopolitically vis-a-vis the United States. The United States and China, they're the primary antagonists. And as our guest has said, Russia is the junior partner here. The Chinese will not, in my opinion, allow the Russians to lose. They're not particularly interested about them winning, but they won't let the Russians lose. That's the key thing here. And the Chinese actually want the war to end. I think it's overall disruptive for them, economically speaking. So they would like to have a situation Russia doesn't lose, like no winners, no losers, a ceasefire, a demilitarized zone, and economics return, and their economic interests are then served by good, peaceful transactions economically with Europe.
Mr. Fisher, Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much to the two witnesses for being in attendance today. My first question is of a general nature that I'd ask of both of you. And just as a preamble, Justin Massy said that there's strong pressure on Ukraine given the upcoming counteroffensive. Despite the support of certain demands from the Ukraine, the West is thinking that a ceasefire could follow these Ukrainian successes on the ground. So what do you think about an eventual ceasefire? Given the current lay of the land, do you believe that legitimately a ceasefire would benefit Russia more than it would benefit Ukraine? Your thoughts, please.
The question of ceasefire after the offensive in this coming now and in the summer, the question is how successful will the Ukrainians be? The Ukrainians have been very skeptical about ceasefires. They see ceasefire as a temporary recess for the Russians, that the Russians can then get their act together and continue the war. On the other hand, there may come a point of time in time, it may not be this fall, it may be next year, where both sides, Ukrainians and Russians, come to the point where militarily they are unable to push each other any further. So that if you come to the point where further military action does not advance your political objectives, then the question is, why are you continuing to fight? An example is 1953 Korea, the Korean War. It ended finally when neither side could push the other. And it was felt that a war of attrition had reached a level of exhaustion, and therefore peace or a ceasefire. In Korea, there's no peace. It's just still a war, but it's a ceasefire. So the question is the ceasefire role in the Russia-Ukraine war. It's not exactly the same situation, but it would come when a ceasefire serves the interests of both the Russians and the Ukrainians. They both have to want it more than the war. And there were no guarantees it would be a continual ceasefire.
Mr. Jenkins?
Mr. Jenkins.
I certainly would agree with Mr. Rasoulis' remarks that it depends on the outcome of these projected offensives and how they occur. Right now, I don't believe that either side would see a ceasefire in its interest. Russia, I believe, is strongly committed. Certainly the propaganda that it is projecting at home and abroad is that it has the resolve to continue this at whatever cost for as long as necessary, albeit at a huge cost in casualties. The Russians have made very modest gains. Right now, I don't see them being interested in backing off. I think that the Russian government may be confident that it can crack the Western alliance and ultimately, through fear and fatigue, persuade NATO members to perhaps even begin to trim their support of Ukraine. I certainly don't think a ceasefire right now is in Ukraine's interest. I agree with my fellow panelist here that much will depend on this forthcoming offensive, but a ceasefire, a stalemate, a frozen war that allows Russia to renew the conflict at any time is of disadvantage to Ukraine. I go back to my previous comments that rebuilding Ukraine, getting the investments to make that happen is not likely to take place under the guns of the Russians, under the shadow of potential renewed wars, and therefore, absent some kind of firm security guarantee, there is no advantage to Ukraine in a ceasefire, at least at this time.
So just to push back on that, given that Ukraine has no interest in a ceasefire right now, then the upcoming offensive may be crucial. To what extent is Ukraine looking for better support from the West to have engaged in a counterattack? Or is weather something that will be factored in? For example, snow. Are we waiting for enhanced support from the West for the Ukraine to engage in a counteroffensive?
So the Western support has already been factored into this offensive, in the sense that the Ukrainians have been waiting and have been receiving and are now integrating the tanks, the artillery, the ammunition. So the calculus is that this offensive has a reasonably good prospect, at least in the operational level, because of the Western weaponry and the training that has gone into this. So, but this will be expended. You know? And then the question comes, after both forces have used up their energy for this level, what happens in the fall? And what happens, as you say, as winter comes? These are the calculuses. As this is what, and that's 4 or 5 months from now, after a major battle. Very difficult to guess what will happen, except that the calculus always is, what's my advantage to continue military action versus what's my advantage for a ceasefire? And both sides will do that.
Thank you, Madame Normandin. 6 minutes, Madame Matheson.
Thank you both for appearing today. Mr. Azulis, I think you had said that Canada actually had done pretty much what it can and has done it well in terms of the defensive side. Can you talk about that deterrence? Have we done everything that we can on the deterrence side? And where do you see we could do more?
Sure. Well, deterrence, it's NATO has the deterrence. And so the deterrence has been for Article 5 applied to NATO territory. There was no NATO or Canadian deterrent put in to defend Ukraine. Ukraine was, in fact, before the war started, President Biden said very clearly that NATO will not go to war, the United States will not go to war against Russia over Ukraine. So Ukraine never had a deterrent. It was always to defend itself with Western support. But the deterrence, and deterrence really is linked to the nuclear weapons. And so, because you have conventional defense, nuclear deterrence. And NATO functions like that. It has the two. And so all of the NATO territory has the benefit, like the Baltic states or Poland in that area, that should Russia attack, the initial defense would be the conventional forces. But NATO has the right at any point in time to use nuclear weapons to defend itself should the conventional defense fail. And that's where the nuclear deterrent comes in.
Despite UN treaties?
Well, there's nothing in the NATO doctrine that is in violation to the UN treaties.
That's true, but I mean, ultimately they've signed on to UN treaties in terms of that non-use.
No, it is first use or no first use of nuclear weapons does not in and of itself violate, as far as I'm aware, of anything in the UN Charter. I mean, the Cold War, that policy was in place right since the early 50s.
Okay. So in terms of the international arms trades treaties that we have signed, certainly there have been the states, the United States, Russia, that have backed away from those agreements. Maybe you could talk about what that's. I mean, there have been long-term impacts, of course, of that, but how do we find a way back, I guess, to planning for more progress?
Got it. So it's our arms control. And arms control, yes, there is almost very little left of all the agreements. I myself was part of the conventional arms control discussions in Vienna back in the 1990 period. That's all gone. START has been suspended. So START is the strategic level nuclear forces. And the Russians have not abrogated it, but they have suspended it, which means no inspections, none of that stuff. But it's just barely hanging on. So the question is, and with the arms control comes confidence building, where you actually go and visit the other side and inspect and so on, and that builds confidence. That's all gone. So we are, as our guest, Mr. Jenkins said, we're in a perilous situation. This is one of the most difficult times since the bad days of the Cold War. And the question is, we have to, I would argue, yes, we need to rebuild arms control. We need to rebuild confidence and security building measures, but we need to establish a peace first, or at least a ceasefire. And that's a way.
Chicken and egg, right?
It's a chicken and egg, but I mean, on the other hand, when you're physically at war, it's very difficult to construct confidence building measures.
So some of the conversations that we've had in this committee, I mean, they've been along a lot of those lines in terms of taking everything away from Russia, in terms of having those conversations, ensuring that they're no longer or moving along the same line, or continuing on with conversations as part of the Arctic Council, and pushing them out. Can you talk about that and the input or the problems maybe that causes, or if there's any way around that, or what you suggest?
I'm one of those who believes in diplomacy and diplomatic linkages. So I've never, because all war ends in some kind of a negotiated settlement, or at least even a ceasefire. Yeah, but even a ceasefire. Korea, I mean, there is no negotiated end to the Korean War, but there is a negotiated ceasefire to the Korean War. That all happens ultimately through diplomacy. And at the end of the day, the diplomatic lifeline needs to be maintained. In the Cold War, there were times when we basically had one lifeline through the mutual balanced force reduction talks that were going on, and that was the only time where diplomats were actually meeting and talking, but at least we kept that going. Because it's very important to keep the dialogue going. In the 1973 October War, Kissinger and the Soviets, the Americans and Soviets, worked very hard to keep the Israelis and the Syrians and the Egyptians from actually setting off a nuclear weapon, which Israel had. You know? So they kept the dialogue always going. So anyways, I'm giving you a long answer to saying diplomacy, dialogue is critical, regardless of the fighting that goes on. Yitzhak Rabin once said that you don't make peace with your enemies, you make peace with unsavory. You don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with the unsavory enemies. But you need to talk to them to do that.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to talk about maybe what could come out of Vilnius and what you would hope would come out of that conference moving forward.
Well, from what I'm aware of, the Lithuanians who are hosting it, their big thing is to get everybody to plus up to 2% of GDP. That is the Lithuanian position. And so I know that they're pounding around the doors here in Ottawa, trying to get Canada to plus up to 2%. And they would even say 2% is a floor, not a ceiling, and so on. Yeah. So that's what the Lithuanian agenda is. They want to go hard on strengthening, and they also want to make sure that the eastern flank, the plus-ups, going from battalion group to brigade group, that's actually in place. So as the Lithuanians drive it, that's where they're going. They really want to push the hard defensive positions.
Ms. Mattson, Mr. Kelly, 5 minutes. Second round.
Thanks. Mr. Rasilius, you talked about the strength of Canada's contribution, and you sort of praised the effort to date and characterized it as applying the maximum capability that's possible. But the recent American leaks had indicated that our allies, including the United States, are skeptical or concerned about Canada's ability to maintain NATO battle groups while aiding Ukraine. So how sustainable is the present deployment? How have failures to increase personnel numbers jeopardized our ability to maintain even the current commitments that we have made, or to enable Canada to up our contribution to ensuring that Ukraine ultimately prevails?
My understanding of the leaks that you referred to is that what they're saying is that Canada, what the concern of some allies are, is that we cannot maintain or take on another operational assignment other than what we've got now. That's the issue. So yes, we can't. That's why we didn't go to Haiti, I assume. You know? Now the question then becomes: it's really the brigade or the battalion going to brigade level group in Latvia. That is the real question. And we have not yet seen the Canadian government come forth with its plans. I understand that there is planning underway for that, discussions underway for that, but that's the litmus test to come. And I suspect that at Vilnius, I'm guessing, that maybe the Canadian government will announce it there.
Okay, so you think there is capacity there? It's not.
My understanding is that we, the Canadian armed military, are going to work toward establishing, as lead nation, a brigade group. But again, we are not the sole providers of forces for that brigade group. So I'm sure that we are going around the NATO circles, and there's another group of countries that are with us in Latvia, and they are plussing up as well. And so we're negotiating how do we all together get to the brigade.
Okay. I'm going to go back to something you said about China and the apparent, or you said that you thought China's goal was to ensure that Russia doesn't lose so much as that. But what does Russia not losing even look like? The minimalist positions of both sides don't leave room for a compromise solution. At least I don't see one. Could you? I mean. Well, go ahead. I'll let you.
So not losing, because losing is going back to the 1991 borders of Ukraine, including the Russians losing Crimea and losing the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. That's something that they've always had. Even in 1991, when Ukraine became independent, the Russians had a lease arrangement with Ukraine to keep the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. So that, from the Russian point of view, would be an existential defeat. So the Chinese, I believe, do not want that to happen. So it would be something short of that. And so then you have scenarios. There is a return to the February 24, 2022 line, for example, the Minsk II lines and so on. Those are options that are being discussed. But
those would be Ukraine losing to the Ukrainian side.
Everyone loses. Like no winners, no losers, you can say.
Okay. Then I'll maybe go to. So I've got about a minute left. I'll maybe go to Mr. Jenkins about productivity capability. The expenditure of basic artillery shells and ammunition. I'm not talking about smart or sophisticated guided ordnance, but just plain artillery shells. How can Western countries, in particular Canada, if you can comment on Canada's productive capability, what needs to be done to ensure that Ukraine just flat out doesn't run out of shells?
If we're talking about artillery shells, and we're not talking about smart weapons are more complicated because the pieces to them involve more than a single country. Manufacturing is very, very complicated. If we're talking about old-fashioned artillery shells, then this is a matter of manufacturing capability. Years ago, decades ago, we had this capacity. It has understandably atrophied over the years without a Cold War push behind it. I think the military services have been understandably I don't want to say mesmerized, but certainly attracted to the more high-tech weapons and the idea artillery tubes and old-fashioned 155 shells was not the most exciting thing. As it turns out, they in this particular type of war have proved to be critical. I don't think it's a matter of any country's individual capacity. I think that is a matter of NATO planning and, in a sense, parsing out who can do what to bring up the overall level of production. Defense budgets on the production of weapons tend to be geared a great deal toward the national industry. And
we're unfortunately going to have to leave Mr.
Right.
Kelly's inquiries there. He's very cleverly turned 5 minutes into 6.5. We've got Ms. Lambropoulos.
Thank you.
5 minutes, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to begin by thanking both of our witnesses for being here to answer our questions today. I'll start. I don't mind who answers me first. There are general questions that I'd like answers from both of you on, if possible. I'd like to know what your take is on the consequences of Ukraine losing this war. I know that in the beginning and from the beginning, NATO stated that they would not go to war, as was mentioned just previously, for Ukraine. Of course, they are trying to support in whatever way that they can in terms of military equipment. But what are the consequences, in your view, of Ukraine losing this war? And how we've also heard a little bit about the different opinions or the divergence that could occur between NATO allies. What are some of the ways that you believe we can stop that from happening? What are some of the ways that Canada, for example, can play a role in keeping countries together and on that right path?
Well, let me start off with that. First of all, if by losing you mean that Russia succeeds in regime change in Ukraine, I think that would have a major impact. It would, even though NATO leaders have said they're not going to go to war with Russia in Ukraine. Nonetheless, a great deal of Western credibility is on the line in how this turns out. A true loss, a dramatic loss, would question the credibility of the alliance. The strength of the alliance has always been, of course, that it was intended to deter, initially, to deter a massive Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Alliances deter. When they actually get to war, then it becomes a lot more complicated. I think we would see, if there was a loss, we would see two things happening at the same time. We would see some fragmenting, some fracturing of the alliance. Some of the countries that I've already indicated are in the less enthusiastic, wavering category. I think might find ways to if not remove themselves from the alliance, in a sense, slide into kind of soft self-Finlandization, if I can say that, where, in a sense, they attempt to avoid provoking the wrath of Russia. At the same time, I think for some countries, for example, Poland, the Baltic republics, we would see a desperate redoubling of effort so that Russia not be lured by perceptions of victory in Ukraine and a weak supine NATO into pushing further, and whether it's Moldova, whether it's the Baltic republics, or somewhere else attempting to advance. That certainly has been the long-term objective that has been outlined by President Putin himself.
On that, actually, before we get an answer from our other witness, but if you can maybe comment on on the next question, and then we'll go back. So I would also like to know, there are a lot of, public opinion, I guess, in some of the Western countries is that there may be too much spending on this particular war, that, I guess the general public may not see a need to continue spending. Maybe they don't necessarily know what the implications could be or the consequences could be if it goes in one way and not another. Do you believe that that public opinion has any way of swaying the government to, I guess in the United States or on our side in Canada, to make a different decision or to change the way that we're doing things?
In 20 seconds or less, please.
I think the public opinion on the street initially has been pushing the governments. The valiant defense put up by the Ukrainians has been inspiring to many, and perhaps persuaded some governments to go further than they had imagined they would at the outset. At the same time, if we look at elections coming up in this country, if we look at political developments in the European countries, 2024 will be very interesting in terms of actually how those divided sentiments that you point to will play out in actual elections.
Thank you, Ms. Lambropoulos. Colleagues, if we're going to get to a third round, which I think everyone does want to get to because that will include all members, I'm going to have to run a harder clock. So, 2.5 minutes seulement.
2.5 minutes, please, and only 2.5 minutes, Ms. Lenormandin. A question for Mr. Jenkins, but also Mr. Raius can chime in if you wish afterwards. We've been talking a lot about NATO, Ukraine, Russia, but we seem to be forgetting the other countries of the BRIC, Brazil, India, and even more so, countries that we could qualify as fence sitters. There was a good article recently in defence of fence sitters. So I'd like to hear what you think about those other countries that are keeping their distance and not taking a stand or a stance. Should we be worried about them, monitoring them more closely, just so that we don't lose any support they may be able to offer for Ukraine, or even switch sides and support Russia? And, for example, Africa, what about it?
Look, the idea of fence sitters, especially in a developing world, in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America, is not a new one. There was, remember going back to the years of the Cold War, we referred to these countries as third world countries, meaning third world as opposed to being clearly in the Soviet camp or in the Western camp. So those attitudes have not always fundamentally changed. I think that there has been an erosion of diplomatic efforts in many of these countries. That is, efforts by the United States, by Canada, I don't want to include Canada because I don't comment on Canada, but by the European countries. A neglect of diplomacy in these areas that both China and Russia have, in some circumstances, taken advantage of. And there still is a long hangover from the colonial era, from the behavior of some of the European countries, especially from the behavior of my own country, that is off-putting, if I can use that mild term, to many of the countries in these continents that you have identified. So there it is really more serious diplomacy in order to, that we're really going to have to battle diplomatically, as well as, I believe, support military efforts to deter Russia from further
Thank you, Ms.
aggression.
Normandine. 2.5 minutes, Ms. Madsen.
Mr. Jenkins, I kind of wanted to build off of some of the lines of questioning that Ms. Lambropoulos was discussing. You've done a lot of writing about Russian disinformation campaigns in the United States, and I just wanted to hear about if you see any impact on that in the United States in terms of how it can impact the support for Ukraine, what you've seen, and just expand upon, I think, what you were already trying to talk about before.
Look, Russia can win in Ukraine one of two ways. It can either win on the ground militarily, or it can win by cracking resolve of the Western nations that are supporting Ukraine. It has devoted a great deal of effort, especially given the lack of progress on the ground militarily. It has devoted a great deal of attention to its continuing information warfare, influence operations. These include both overt efforts at propaganda, but also taking advantage of pre-existing divisions, especially in the United States, where Russian information operations take both sides of any kind of a debate and attempt to drive them further apart and intensify that debate. Now, that's not traditional propaganda, but it's enabled by the kinds of communications technologies we have. We see that going on, and we do see, again, as a consequence of our existing partisan divide in this country, exacerbated by Russian exploitation of that, we really have a major divisions on this issue. And as I say, we will see in the coming elections how this plays out.
Ms. Gallant, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, to Mr. Rasoulis, does the West have a clear strategy or plan even to end the war in Ukraine?
The answer is no. The West position is that Ukraine will drive it. Does Ukraine have a plan? Yes. The Ukrainian plan is to expel all Russian forces from all occupied Ukraine, including Crimea. That is the Ukrainian plan, and the West backs it.
So, Mr. Jenkins, how far do you think Putin is willing to go to maintain his foothold in Ukraine?
You're on mute, Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, you're on mute.
Sorry. An old intelligence hand once told me that when your analysis is reduced to the remote psychoanalysis of what someone will do, you're in trouble. I can't claim to know what's inside Putin's head on this issue, but certainly he is attempting to signal resolve. I think that his brandishing the nuclear issue is a useful way for him to create fear and alarm, essentially a strategy of terror in the West. He's suggesting that if Russia, if faced with a loss, will use nuclear weapons. It distracts from Russia's military shortcomings in the field. It gives humanitarian cover to those who say the war must be halted. It may discourage the West from providing certain kinds of weapons that will allow Ukraine to escalate the war. It allows Russian hawks to indulge in all sorts of bellicose fantasies. I'm not sure that actual use of nuclear weapons would bring a significant military advantage, although Russia could destroy Ukrainian cities. It's not just propaganda, though. Putin does not have to convince his adversaries that he will use nuclear weapons. He simply has to create enough uncertainty that they don't want to run the test to find out. And I think that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing a shaping of perceptions which are as important as battlefield progress in contemporary warfare.
Okay, so you don't think then that Putin sees this conflict as an existential threat to the existence of Russia. Do you see any changes in the way Putin is adapting, and is he adapting quickly enough to the way Ukraine is conducting its defense?
Certainly, the units in the field, even if they were thrown in as poorly trained soldiers and disorganized, there's a very cruel learning process in war. Even inexperienced soldiers become savvy veterans after a certain amount of fighting if they survive, and otherwise they don't survive. So yes, I think we are seeing some operational improvements from what we saw in the initial days of the war. I think certainly Russia has organized itself to provide more weapons and more personnel and throw them into the war. And I think, again, back to the information warfare, there has been an interesting change in the nature of internal Russian propaganda, which is basically informing the Russian people that this is an existential struggle for which they have to be prepared to make long-term sacrifices. That's the message.
Mr. Razoulis, what do you make of the PRC's envoy to France making and his comments over the weekend that claim former Soviet states aren't sovereign nations? Was he just speaking out of line, or are they giving us mixed messages from Beijing?
20 seconds, please.
I think he was speaking out of line because the Chinese government has basically said it was a personal view. I mean, he was postulating things saying there was no international treaty that validated the independence of the post-Soviet states. I mean, but that's really, I don't think that's really has any credibility.
Thank you, Ms. Gallant. He said a lot of dumb things when he was here, too. Mr. May, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've talked about this a little bit in previous meetings, but I want to take us back before the conflict began, and some of the theories as to what was going to happen, whether it was not going to happen at all, whether it was going to be a very quick redrawing of the map, or a complete takeover of Ukraine all the way up to the Polish border. Obviously, none of that has happened. We also were told in those early days that it had to be that way because the Russians could not sustain a longer offensive. They couldn't afford it. They didn't have the finances to do it. So a lot has been said about this. How wrong the establishment got this conflict. And I'm wondering, I'll start with you, Mr. Razoulis. What lessons can we draw from this conflict so far, and in terms of the future of warfare and the types of capabilities? Like what types of capabilities should Canada and its allies be looking to develop and acquire?
Okay, so that's really two fundamental questions. On the thing of the war not going the way people thought it was going to go on either side, I suppose. Wars generally tend to do that. I mean, World War I started in 1914 with one concept, and it ended in 1918 with a completely different concept. And so this war, yes, it was going to be a short, snappy one. The Ukrainians and the Russians were still meeting in March of 2022 to discuss the Minsk II variation of a settlement, well into the war, into a few months. So we don't know where this is going to end up now, but certainly nowhere near anyone thought. Intelligence had it wrong on both sides, as they often do. The lessons learned, though, we're learning that modern warfare is actually, in some ways, taking lessons from the last year of World War I, when there was the strategic stalemate, but what's called stormtroopers. And I don't mean the Nazi thing. I mean the small units. Canadians actually were very, very innovative, as well as the Germans, to have small units that were actually trying to break through the stalemate and advance on each other. Because in what the war is showing us, that with the modern technology, if you move, you're seen, you're killed. So therefore, you've got to figure out ways of how you can actually advance your position without being seen and killed. And that means small unit attacks. That's why when people say this offensive, the Ukrainians may be starting this offensive, they may. And we don't actually know about it because it's not going to be the big wave over the top like it was in the early part of World War I.
And Mr. Jenkins, any thoughts on that, the preconceived notions that we had prior versus where we are now?
I think what we regularly get wrong in net assessments of the strengths of two sides is we can count troops, we can look at weapon systems, we can look at economies, and come to conclusions. Those are things that we can count. We tend to miss what we can't count. The will to fight has made the difference. The Ukrainians put up an extraordinary and, to be sure, unexpected defense on both sides. That defense, in turn, inspired international support, which it would not have done had the Ukrainians been had been quickly defeated. So, despite all of the modern technology weapons, it does come down to the will to fight and perceptions.
Thank you. I'm not sure I have enough time for a proper question. Just to say thank you to both of you for being here today.
Thank you, Mr. May. 2.5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
2.5 minutes, please. Oh.
Mr. Bazan, 5 minutes.
Thank you. That's what I expected happened.
Yes, yes.
I want to thank both our witnesses for being here. We're having this conversation about, that all wars end at the negotiating table. And I know my conversations with Ukrainian officials, they fully appreciate that fact. But as Mr. Jenkins just said, the will to fight and the valor and the dogged determination of the people of Ukraine has to be brought into the equation here, and their right to self-determination. And, essentially, President Zelensky has turned into, a modern-day Winston Churchill in how he's conducted himself and how he's inspired not just Ukrainians, but the free world. Ukrainians, rightfully so, are mistrusting of the peace process. Minsk I, Minsk II were disasters and ultimately ended up in the war that we have today. So there's no trust. And so maybe we're still not at the place of the negotiation tables of trying to find a peaceful resolution. So the question becomes, we know the Ukrainians are going to keep on fighting. We know that the weapon systems they have are surprisingly matching what Russia's brought to bear. And maybe it's more surprising is what Russia hasn't been able to accomplish with what's supposed to be one of the greatest militaries in the world. So my question is about resiliency of the alliance and the support of our citizens, as was alluded to earlier. We are seeing an erosion of that willingness from Canadians, from Americans, from some of our European allies, and to continue to stand with Ukraine. And a lot of that has to do with the success of the Russian information operations and their dissemination of disinformation, misinformation, and outright lies. So my question is, how do we counter that to ensure that Canadians, taxpayers, our military, as well as our allies like the United States, aren't being distracted by fake news?
So the challenge, if I'll go first then, the challenge is in a war of, essentially it's a war of attrition, but there are various dynamics, and we have to see where the Ukrainian offensive will now go. How dynamic will it be? And that dynamism will, in fact, affect public opinion in and of itself. Political leaderships in the West are fully on board with Ukraine. The issue, as you correctly point out, is the populations. And there are various pollings in various countries that suggest that it's not a uniform thing. That certainly the political leadership's uniform, but the people are not necessarily so. And as you and I don't want to make specific points to countries, but generally as you move further west away from the Russian borders and Ukraine's borders, support amongst the populations tend to soften a bit in certain areas. But I think since the United States, and I put the finger on Mr. Jenkins on this one, he can pick it up. The United States is the biggest backer for Ukraine. And the American willingness politically of the people and the Congress to support the president, whether it's this president or the next president, to sustain this effort in what will still be some kind of an attritional warfare is right now uncertain. And I think we're into a very interesting situation. The support is there now, but we know that there are elements of the Republican Party that are not supportive. And we can leave it at that for now. I don't know where it's going to go.
A little more than a minute.
Okay, so just I want to ask the question about, especially with Mr. Razulis's, experience dealing with arms control and nuclear weapons. Russia moving warheads now into Belarus. How do you see that playing out, especially with Putin continually rattling that nuclear saber as a deterrence measure?
Sure. I'll be very quick. This is a key component. I mean, Mr. Jenkins has mentioned that. That is part of Russia's other side. There's the conventional war going on, but there is the nuclear deterrent aspect and the nuclear threat aspect. Putting nuclear forces in Belarus is very consistent with an escalatory rhetoric now that Russia's doing, and they're actually putting forces into Belarus to back up the rhetoric. The key thing then, so there's tactical and then there's strategic nuclear, the thermonuclear stuff. And there I'll just leave my comments with you with Medvedev, the Russian chief of their National Security Council, has stated very clearly in the last month, and he said, Crimea is existential. And Russia will use, and he uses the word, all weapons. That's not just the tactical stuff. That means thermonuclear. To defend Russia. Now, what he's saying is not, he doesn't want to use the stuff, but he wants to threaten, to dissuade, deter Ukrainians with the American pressure on the Ukrainians not to attack Crimea.
Thank you, Mr. Bazan. Mr. Souza, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for your presentations. You really paint a bleak picture, right? There's a prolonged war. It's going to be constant tensions, regardless of peace or ceasefire. There's always going to be constant tensions as we go forward. And there's this geopolitical alliance that Russia's having, possibly with China and other regions, and of course NATO having its risk. We've just heard from a number of others about the concern we have with public opinion, the United States especially, if it starts to soften, what will that do? Is there any chance of a carnation revolution in Russia? A carnation revolution? Sure. I mean, I can't fathom how they can continue, how the military can conceive of using nuclear weapons against their neighbors in a situation which they have, regardless of the propaganda, they have to know that there's something unfathomable about doing this continuously.
Well, I think you've asked two questions. One is about the Russian internal situation and then the nuclear thing. I guess let me put the nuclear thing in one way. I actually don't believe that they would be considering limited nuclear war. I think most deterrent strategists believe that there is no such thing as limited nuclear war. So if you're going to threaten, you're going to threaten thermonuclear. And the best historical example I can give you of that is John Kennedy in 1962, Cuban Missile Crisis. He didn't expect to use the things, but he went on DEFCON 3, which was a level of alert next to the nuclear war, to make the point to the Soviets and Khrushchev that he was serious. And basically, he got what he wanted with that threat. But the internal situation in Russia, though, is that Putin continues to maintain control. He maintains a very stable situation. He has issues. He has the ultranationalists. They are giving him more problems than the so-called liberal Democrats, like guys like Navalny, who are in prison, or Murza, who's just been convicted for 25 years in prison. These people are, in the Russian system, political outliers. The mainstream are the technocrats who help Putin run the government. And basically, they don't have an alternative other than keep going. And the ultranationalists are pushing Putin to do more. not less. So Putin's problem, he's actually fending off people who say you should be fully mobilizing. You should be trying to take out the government in Kyiv. You've got to go west. That's what Putin's trying to manage all the time.
So, Mr. Jenkins, would you agree that a counteroffensive is to be offensive by the West and really build it up?
Look, I certainly agree with my partner's comments on his analysis. First of all, we don't have a good understanding of what the level of opposition to Putin is, either in his immediate circle or the public at large. Putin is in control. We don't have evidence of any popular uprising against him. I think a change of regime to a more democratic regime is probably a long shot. If anything, we could see a change to an even more bellicose leadership in Russia. We are in a very perilous time. This does not end with Ukraine. Whatever happens in Ukraine, we are back in, I think, in a long-term global contest that can easily move in an existential direction. That it's extremely difficult for current generations, and especially given the current media, internet, social media, to grasp what that means. But we are facing a long-term struggle and have to be prepared for that. So the details of this offensive, or by the Russians or by the Ukrainians in Ukraine, is to me an interesting detail, but it doesn't end in Ukraine either way.
You have less than 15 seconds, but I think that's it for you, Mr. Sousa. Yes.
15 seconds.
Yeah. I know. I owe you. Yes, you have to be of a certain age to know what Mr. Jenkins is talking about, and I think I qualify. 2.5 minutes, Madame Normandine, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. A question for both witnesses, starting with Mr. Raziulis. We often talk about the weaknesses of the Russian army, perhaps a little less about the weaknesses of the Ukrainian army, but with the leaks from the Pentagon, we've understood that the supply of ammunition was one of the main weaknesses. But are there other weaknesses we should be concerned about in the long haul that we should address in the short term, if we're able to?
Yes. The principal weakness of the Ukrainian forces are people power. The West can supply the ammunition. Yes, there's a shortage. But at the end of the day, you can bring things in. But when you look at, and the Russians have supply problems too, but they can manufacture and they're bringing it in. The people issue is a factor that the West is not going to supply, because the West, is not going to go to war in Ukraine. That means the Ukrainian military, Ukrainian people have to do the fighting. And there's only so many amounts of Ukrainian men and women who are prepared to go and are able to go, compared to the Russians. And the question is, are there more Russians than there are Ukrainians who can actually go to war and do the fighting? Right now, the situation suggests that the Russians are able to sustain themselves. They have not yet fully mobilized. They've done limited mobilizations. They could do more. And Putin is trying to avoid that right now. He's balancing. But he has the potential. But Ukraine has no more potential to increase. They are doing everything they can.
Monsieur Jenkins.
Mr. Jenkins, would you like to tack on to that?
No, I certainly agree with that. The issue here is a matter of human resources. And again, will to fight. Although I know we're making a lot of references back to World War I in this conversation, which is fascinating. But going back to World War Russian forces were advancing successfully in 1917 in a great Kerensky offensive, and then the military simply collapsed. And I would not rule out, that's not an optimistic forecast. I'm simply saying that we have to, consider the possibility that the Russian forces in the field at a certain part, suffering certain levels of casualties, could collapse. On the Ukrainian side, I agree that they don't have the human resources that Russia has, but the determination really suggests that they will continue that. And in fact, I would hazard a guess here that even if there were a regime change in Kiev, a Russian takeover, that we would still see a continuing armed resistance movement
We're going to have
Ukraine.
to, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I don't think we'll have to charge extra for the history lesson on World War I, World War II, Cold War, Korean War. I think we pretty well covered everything so far in the last hour and a half. 2.5 minutes, Ms. Madison.
Well, I think it's just a sort of a built up from that conversation, and I'll ask Mr. Razoulis to, I guess, weigh in on what was just said by Mr. Jenkins. But in the last panel we had on this last week, we were asking Russia's biggest weakness, and the witness said that it's training and morale. So that feeds off of entirely what Mr. Jenkins was saying. But Mr. Razoulis, do you want to add on to that in the end?
Yes. He was referring to the Borislav offensive, which I fully understand, but that's because things were very bad in Russia back home, and the Russian army was not being properly supplied, and they collapsed. Now, and the Russian Revolution was starting. Now, the question is, we're not at the point yet where there's a Russian Revolution starting, and the Russian military, while not having some proper 100% supplies, are still being supplied. So it's not the way it was in 1916-17. Could it become that? It could. We just don't know. But right now, well, the sanctions haven't done everything they're supposed to do because the Russians have done workarounds. And again, I'm not an economic specialist, but I will say, from my understanding of history, the only time sanctions have actually worked, where you actually get the political effect, is South Africa, where the apartheid sanctions took place, or actually apartheid ended because of sanctions. But in all other things, for Cuba in 1959, the Americans have had sanctions on Cuba since 1959. I mean, they keep going. So Iran, I mean, you name it, North Korea. Sanctions do not affect the political outcomes that the people putting the sanctions usually want to do. So the Russians have done workarounds. They are able to have their internal economy, and they've actually strengthened their internal economy. So the Russian ammunition factories are working full around the clock. Russian tank factories, there's one in Siberia that's taking old T-62s and so on and remodeling them constantly. They're running around the clock, and they're putting them into the front line.
So I guess they're the ultimate benefactors of said war.
The merchants of death and all that sort of thing, yeah.
Colleagues, we are in the third round. We're in the last two questioners of the third round. Mr. Bazan, final 5 minutes for the Conservatives, and Ms. O'Connell, final 5 minutes for the Liberals.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So when we look at, we talked about the comments made by the Chinese ambassador to France. We had recent comments made by the South African ambassador to Canada that criticized us for not being the soft power that he envisions us to be, and being too closely aligned with Ukraine. And I'm just wondering, are those appropriate comments to be made by so-called diplomats? To be engaged more in bilateral relationships with the countries that they're stationed in. Or is this part of a greater strategy to undermine Western support, to question the resiliency of the alliance, particularly here in Canada? And essentially, it's I think some people have described it as wolf diplomacy.
So on the Chinese factor, I think we've spoken about that, and we know that that's not the Chinese position. But South Africa is an interesting one, and Mr. Jenkins has alluded to colonial histories and so on. And the government of South Africa, and we just spoke about apartheid, the Soviet Union in the Cold War was very much supportive of the anti-apartheid movement, and they are the ruling party. So they remember that. And so what we get from South Africa, we've had this for months now, they've been exercises that have the Chinese Navy, the Russian Navy, and the South African Navy have been exercising. In fact, they were doing it around the anniversary of the war in February.
Right now.
And they're still doing it right now. So the point is that the South Africans have a historical legacy, and they're speaking to that. And that's where they're coming from.
So the Chinese ambassador made the comment that the former Soviet states don't have any way to be recognized internationally. Can the same argument then be made about Russia, and especially them never accepting the UN Charter, never passing a single resolution in the Duma to recognize the UN Charter or provide them the ascension to the UN Security Council? It perturbed me greatly to watch just the last couple of days ago see Sergei Lavrov chair the UN Security Council meeting.
Well, I mean, the point is that international states become legitimate when they have international recognition. And that's really not even 100% based on the United Nations. When the Soviet Union came apart, it was individual countries, like Canada was one of the first that recognized a number of the countries, the Baltics, Ukraine, and so on. It's the actual states' recognition. The United Nations is an umbrella organization, but it is not a world government. And it's the actions of individual states that count. And so individual states have recognized certain countries, and that's what counts.
Mr. Jenkins, you recently wrote that the longer the war drags on, the more risk Putin might be willing to take. So the question I have for you is, when we talk about resiliency among Canada, U.S., and our citizens, how much longer are the people of Russia prepared to sacrifice their young men and women in this war?
Again, I would love to be able to answer that. We have no way of providing an answer to that. I certainly agree with my partner here that we have no evidence of a significantly strong anti-Putin movement in Russia.
Mr. Jenkins, we did see a lot of Russian men flee the country to escape conscription. So, and is that starting to play out amongst the populace? Is that they just do not want to be sending their sons and daughters, their husbands and wives to the front?
No, I think that was significant, and in fact, given that those are individuals that are probably the best educated, well-trained, and therefore most likely to find employment in other countries, that represented a significant loss. At the same time, it probably reduced some of the internal pressure or sources of internal pressure on Russia. A lot of the recruits for the Russian forces are coming from the distant provinces, different towns. They're not sending the sons of the elite middle classes in St. Petersburg and Moscow into this war yet. That would change things possibly. One aside I want to make here very, very quickly. We're talking about human resources and trained human resources. Finding a way to usefully employ and exploit that exodus from Russia is something we should be paying very, very close attention to. These are people that have made personal decisions to avoid the draft. They have pulled up the roots and left the country. That is a potential resource. I'm not talking about giving them rifles and sending them into the front in Ukraine, but that is a significant resource that could be useful to the West.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Bazan, final 5 minutes. Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for being here today. It's been very interesting to hear your perspectives. and certainly tying it back to the past. Sometimes, not reinventing the wheel, and we can kind of see what's playing out. One of my questions is kind of alluding to what was already said, but to both of you, if you'd like to chime in on this. I find it very interesting on the misinformation piece that, especially in the U.S., you see Republican right-wing commentators now, talking about their support for Putin, and never did I think I'd see the day where it'd be members in the Republican Party that are actually, supporting Putin outright and sharing very clearly, Kremlin-type lines or Russian media lines. So I guess 2 points or questions is the misinformation into the West. I mean, we even see it on probably all of our social media in terms of if you ever post in support of Ukraine, all of a sudden you get all these anti-Ukraine messages. So is the misinformation in the West, how critical is that in terms of the overall public and that support for us as Canadians to continue to support Ukraine? And kind of the second point of this question is, in the U.S., the political sphere, how solid are the institutions to ensure that if there were a change in leadership or whatnot, do we risk the U.S.'s support of Ukraine, that not being as strong? And let's be honest, the U.S. contribution to supporting Ukraine is significant like Canada's, but that would be crucial. So could you maybe speak to, I know that was a long preamble, but any sort of change or concerns from the U.S. political situation right now?
Let me, since you've mentioned the U.S. so many times, let me go first and very, very quickly. First of all, I am ferociously nonpartisan, but that doesn't mean I'm not aware of the political situation. The partisan divide in the United States has been growing deeper over the years and is so deep now that in fact it has projected deep into the realm of national security and foreign policy of the United States. And so that accounts for a certain amount of the criticism of U.S. support for Ukraine. It's because of who is in the White House right now, and because of the attitudes of the previous occupant of the White House. In addition to that, there's a further layer in that Russia portrays itself as being a defender of certain values against certain liberal decadence in its propaganda of transsexual predators, things of this sort. That resonates with an extremist portion of our population. So we're talking about values issues as well, in addition to the very traditional people who are determined to promote peace and who approach it from the other side of the spectrum. I honestly watch this carefully. I don't know how this is going to play out in 2024, but I would say that it is certainly much going to be part of the political discussion in this country going forward.
So if I can just, speaking non in the U.S. thing, but in general, about your question about misinformation and so on, the antidote to misinformation is education. And if people are not being educated, and there has to be a self-education as well in this, and there will always be people who get duped. But if you watch the information spaces, the experts we do, you can start to pick up pretty quickly what's actually generated misinformation versus valid information, and you make your own. But you have to be an educated person to actually watch the stuff, and you can see what's fabrication after a while. There has an artificiality to it, and of course, it's inconsistent over time. and if you watch that. So education is really the antidote, and I think that there's a universal sort of acceptance by people that that's how you have to deal with it. There's been a lot of that in the Baltic states and in Finland and so on, and those they have worked hard to do that by educating the population. There is no magic answer other than education.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that's going to have to bring our time to an end. I want to, on behalf of the committee, thank both of you for A, extending your time, but B, this has been very informative, very thoughtful. Some of us on the committee just returned from Taiwan, and probably one of the most impressive sessions we had was how the Taiwanese deal with misinformation and disinformation, and their standard is to have a response within 2 hours. Their regular practice is to have it within an hour, and we could learn a lot from the way the Taiwanese deal with misinformation and disinformation, which is we're not nearly as coherent as are they. So with that, colleagues, again, thank you for your presence here. It's been very helpful. Colleagues, before I bring the gavel down, I just want to make note that the Latvian Minister of Defense will be here on May 9th and 10th, unfortunately not available during committee times. I'm not sure. She is available May 9th, 8 to 12, or Wednesday, May 10th, 12 to 5:30. If you could indicate to the clerk your preference.
Sorry, say that again. Who is not available?
The Latvian Minister of Defense can't meet during committee time. So Tuesday, May 9th, 8 to 12, Wednesday, May 10th, 12 to 5:30. So just give an indication to the clerk what you'd like. You know about the April 28th meeting on health and transition. May 2nd, the minister. May 5th is canceled. 9, 12, and 16, health and transition studies. May 19th is canceled. French Embassy, June the 1st. Presumably you're going to get invitations for June the 1st. And the Polish Deputy Minister of Defense is coming May 8th. We're awaiting confirmation of room and services. So, Ms. Gallant.
Would the clerk please put that down on a calendar for disbursement amongst all the members?
Absolutely. Yeah. With that, meeting adjourned. Thank you.